throttle. Circuit breakers in.
We have separation.
Inboard and outboards are on. We're coming forward with the side stick.
All looks good.
Roger.
I've got a blowout. Amber 3.
Get your pitch to 0.
Pitches out. I can't hold altitude.
Direction Alpha hold is off. Trim selected emergency.
Flight com, I can't hold it. She's breaking up. She's breaking.
Steve Austin, astronaut. A man barely alive.
Gentlemen, we can rebuild him. We have the technology. We have the capability to make the world's first bionic man. Steve Austin will be that man. Better than he was before. Better, stronger, faster.
Hi everyone, welcome once again to Geekfest Rants. My name is Carlos Perron, and joining me here today is James. Say hi, James.
Hello, everybody.
Today we are going to be examining a pretty old show that we all seem to have watched at one point or another in our younger days, something called The $6 Million Man. I'm sure most people listening to this are familiar with it, but they might not have necessarily watched the entire series or been able to go through from first season to last season. I don't even remember how many seasons there were because the manner in which I watched it was really weird, which I'll explain to you in a little bit. But one of the reasons why this show has all of a sudden popped up, in the radar of, geekdom is because they just released Season 1 on DVD, which is something they hadn't done in this manner yet. James, what do you know about this new DVD that's just came out?
Well, about a year or two ago, a Time Life series release of The $6 Million Man came out, and it was a little bit over $300, and not a lot of people were willing to pay that kind of money, so this is a season-by-season release that is about $20, $30 per season, which is how most people buy their collectible DVDs these days. Now, the original was really well produced, nice box, nice extras. Lee Majors, who played Steve Austin, obviously, was supporting it during its release, did interviews, but it's very expensive, so I didn't want to get involved in that. So now that this is available in a much more affordable package, I have been checking it out, and this was something that I was a big, big fan of when it first came out. I mean, there's very few things that I was this excited about, but the $6 Million Man was probably, one of the first things that I wanted to be Steve Austin.
Well, let's try to date ourselves a little bit here. What year are we talking about here?
Okay, well, there was originally a made-for-TV movie, and it was called Cyborg, and it was based on a novel by Martin Caidin, and it was, basically Steve Austin adventures. And they kind of took the TV movie is based on the first book pretty closely, but they took bits and pieces, and there's only 4 books, so eventually, they were coming up with their own stories. And it was about a man who was an astronaut, but this involves him when he was a test pilot.
Okay.
Fighter jets, high altitude jets, things like that. And he's on this mission, testing a new vehicle, and it crashes. Now, he winds up being used as a guinea pig for the government to use these new parts on him. And to them, this is nothing more than a guy who fulfills a need, and they're testing to see if this works.
Now, are we dealing with Lee Majors here, or this is a completely different cast?
No, this is Lee Majors still.
Okay.
What's different is some of the supporting characters.
Oh, okay.
The government liaison is not the same one in the series, except they kind of go back and they make it seem like it's the same guy, but that actor was Darren McGavin, who is known from many things. Kolchak, I mean, we've talked about
Christmas Story, which is
something we've talked about him quite a bit in the different geek type stuff we watch.
Yeah.
And
now is he playing Oscar or
he's playing a different
type of Oscar?
Yes, he's playing a different named character,
okay.
And he's a real bad guy. Like, he seems like a typical government guy who is not interested in anything but the bottom line and what Steve Austin can do for them and for the U.S. government, and not very emotional, basically. we need this guy. We don't care. Do what you got to do. And if he dies, we'll find another guy. We'll find another guinea pig. And when it went to series eventually, they used a different character, and that became Oscar. But anyway, in the TV movie, it basically follows how they reconstruct him. And we used to see this in the opening credits when the show was actually in the series.
Had this thing aired?
Yeah, this was an actual TV movie in 1973.
Okay.
And I don't know if they had an idea of this as being a series. I have a feeling they did. But my opinion is that it wasn't set in stone. A lot of this stuff wasn't, the way we know it.
Right.
So very few people would have seen this. I remember watching it not when it was first on, but when it was rerun, probably at like a Sunday afternoon movie or something like that, a couple years later. And I didn't remember every detail of it. I remember the basics of it. So I was real fortunate when the DVD was released now to have seen it. And sadly, I was a little disappointed. It's hard to explain when you've lived through it, but people always say modern attention span has diminished, and it's hard to believe. I'm like, I watch the same stuff. It's, we still watch Star Wars. That was 70s. We still watch a lot of stuff, but 70s pacing is a lot different than 2000s pacing.
And TV pacing is even slower than film pacing.
And this was real slow and real ponderous, and it wound up feeling like it was a lot older than it was. The subject was still interesting, and the type of things that they were doing and, the adventure, but it was definitely a TV movie from the 70s. So I was a little disappointed in that. Then there was 2 movies afterwards. But I think at this point they had decided they were going to make this a series. And so some things had changed. That's when Oscar Goldman made his appearance, and they basically said that he was the government guy, almost as if we ignored that it was Darren McGavin.
Okay.
They call it retconning now and
he
stuff
was
like that.
He was a nicer character.
Yeah, more sympathetic, he and Steve had a better relationship, where the other guy was more adversarial.
Right.
This guy is more like a friend or a mentor or guide.
And how about the lead doctor? Is he in this?
Yeah, that was Rudy Wells. Now, that was played by a different man in the TV movie. Then it was played by a different guy in these early series, and then it was played by a different guy later on. So he's supposed to be basically the same guy, but that's okay. I mean, TV worked like that. There were, various Darren Stevens. There was a lot of different changes in actors over, if somebody wasn't available, they just basically got a new actor. So these TV movies tried to make him more like a James Bond character rather than an outsider. He was more suave. They had him in suits. They had him in, shirtless more often. Now, hey, Lee Major's a good-looking guy, but it just seemed a little weird. I'm more familiar with the $6 Million Man running around, and seeing him like this was a little weird. And the weirdest thing was the open, and they had Dusty Springfield singing like a James Bond theme of the $6 Million Man, and it's really something you have to see. It's definitely dated, and it's definitely weird.
Now, did the open for these TV movies, were they similar to the final opening where they show you the crash, and which I don't even remember? Is that footage, original footage for the show, or it's just like stock footage from some crash somewhere?
The actual crash was American test pilot footage.
So it's real footage.
So that's real stuff. But the crash in the original TV movie, that's certain footage. But then when they did the theme and in the later series, it's slightly different footage and different dialogue. So it's just basically trying to get the point across in a quick open, what happened and why this guy's in this predicament. But it was more organized in the TV movie. So it was very, very thorough. But like I said, by the time they got to the second 2 TV movies, or, they call them like more pilot, another pilot, and it was closer to the Steve Austin we know, but still no beep 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 toot 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 toot, none of that stuff.
Now hold on, let me ask you one more question. In the opening that I remember again, there are certain shots of him being assembled, holding up prosthetic limbs and robotic limbs. Again, were those from these earlier movies?
Yeah, they actually showed that.
That was worked into it.
Yeah, they actually showed that how it worked, the different various parts in it. There was a little nuclear reactor type thing in the arm.
They're holding the eye and they're holding the leg.
Yeah, and so a lot is not made. Once he's put back together, they don't discuss it.
Now, let me ask you another question. On these earlier TV movies, did they also establish the fact that, this is a TV show, so you can't really show somebody running fast without it looking comical, like a Benny Hill skit. So they gave you the slow-mo run, which you would then understand.
That hadn't been established. That type of stuff wasn't really established. They kept it pretty straight in the early parts.
So what kind of
They showed him running fast. They
powers.
did speed it up into a point where they probably made the camera faster, and he ran slower. So whatever the combination.
He looks
was,
like he's running fast.
It looks like he's running fast, but not to the point where it's comical like the Benny Hill stuff.
Right. And how about
they probably had him running at a slower pace, and they just. When they show wide shots or some surveillance footage of him training, they show it.
And his arm is like...
And they show a speedometer on the... like an analog speedometer showing that the speed is now 25, 30, 35, 40
now,
miles per hour,
what about his
42
arm?
miles per hour.
Obviously, strength...
It shows him he can bang. He's pushing into walls.
Okay, so you could see that.
Yeah.
But are they slow-moing it also, the arm, or no? Not at this point.
Very slightly. All that gimmicky stuff that we know as the $6 Million Man...
Even the eye?
Really didn't start yet. They didn't even show what we saw with the eye. It's established his eye has been replaced,
and he has some
but they haven't shown any of that. Like in the second TV movie, they show him almost like when you see the green from Night Vision.
Okay.
But they don't have the whole thing where they zoom in and they make it seem like
that
a
came
digital
later.
optics or something like that. Yeah, they added that stuff in down the line.
All right, so what happens after these TV movies?
So the TV movies air, and I guess, they're accepted as that now the show's going to be a series. And then finally it's a series. We're a few episodes in. That's when we start getting some of the noises and the gimmicks. And in fact, the original $6 Million Man noises actually came from another character who was another guy who was turned into a Bionic.
Oh, really?
A colleague of Steve's who is considered, a defective cyborg. And, Steve has to battle him, and it's tough because it's his friend, things like that. So that was basically the first season is establishing this character, establishing the OSI, who he works for. It's basically like a CIA operative, special missions. He has to go into where other people can't because he can get himself out, his strength, things like that. Various 70s Cold War type of things.
Now, what are some of the more memorable, obviously without having to go episode by episode, but I seem to remember like some key highlights of the show where he gets to fight some characters that are very heavy sci-fi characters. I remember something about a Bigfoot robotic type of situation.
Well, yeah, that actually didn't come till a bit later. The first season was establishing who he is. The second season, they get into more exotic type things. By the end of the season, they establish that Jamie Summers, his one-time girlfriend, is in an accident, and they're going to make her a bionic woman. Now, it's a bit of a spin-off setup, and a bit of an interesting storyline. And it turns out that probably they wanted to have another Bionic series. Wow. And it turns out $6 Million Man was on ABC. Bionic Woman wound up on NBC eventually, which is really interesting because they did have crossover episodes, and that was a little bit odd back in that day when they're very, very protective of their properties.
I guess the network didn't own the material outright because I guess the creators of the show were the ones who get to decide who gets the show.
Yeah, probably that was the situation because basically spin-offs were a network property.
Yeah.
From Archie Bunker, you got Maude and the Jeffersons. From Happy Days, you got Laverne and Shirley, Mork and Mindy, all linchpins of that network's,
Right,
lineup.
They're within the family.
Yeah, so this was a different network, but yet they were having spin-off episodes. So it turns out originally, Jamie Summers is made Bionic, and it's established that she died. But either because of the popularity or because the other network said, hey, we want to do something, by the time we come back, it says, oh, well, even though we had seen her die, no, she really didn't die. Now, nowadays, you can't get away with that kind of stuff. Shows are more mapped out, but no, she really didn't die, and now she's going to have her own adventures, where they do cross over from time to time. And basically, some of those episodes are actually good, memorable episodes. Later in season 3, that's when we get into a little bit absurd, but I think the way the series was going, they had to compete with how times were changing. And by season 3, we have the character that everybody knows as Bigfoot. And Steve Austin is on a mission, and he comes across this creature, and nobody can explain it, and it turns out it's Bigfoot. And the funny part is, it's Andre the Giant playing Bigfoot. Now, in later years, Bigfoot made other appearances. I think Bigfoot eventually made about 5 appearances. And later, Ted Cassidy, who played Lurch in the Addams Family, was Bigfoot. So Bigfoot went from being a little bit fuller to being a little taller and thinner. You can
my God.
But anyway, they were some of the best episodes. And $6 Million Man fans will remember the Bigfoot episodes.
But are these the robotic Bigfoot or some other weird Bigfoot?
Well, it turns out he is robotic, but it's the Bigfoot we all know, but it's their tool, and it's aliens.
Okay.
So it got a little absurd, but it's the middle 70s.
It's a sci-fi show in a way.
The sci-fi era has begun. It's not quite into the Star Wars realm yet.
We're almost there.
But we're getting there, and it winds up being aliens of some type. Star Trek's been around, so I guess they have to put into this sci-fi element. The writers were trying something, and it worked. It was great, and definitely by this point, kids were the big audience, and this was my favorite show. This is all I could talk about up until that point.
And as we get into the 5th season, do you get the feeling the show is wrapping up, or not really?
Yeah, well, it's starting to feel a little bit forced, and I think probably by the time they canceled it in 1978, and they also canceled the Bionic Woman in the same year, they didn't really have any place to go. Star Wars was huge, so now the networks probably canceled this to make room for shows like Battlestar Galactica, which I think they were on at the same time for a little bit, but it was just a whole different era. After Star Wars, things changed, and so Battlestar Galactica was on ABC. NBC got Buck Rogers, so
You're
this
in the
was
late
a
70s, early
yeah.
80s type of deal.
Steve Austin was more of a 70s Cold War character, and we were past that now, and it was, Star Wars everywhere.
Now, you mentioned before that it was a big show with the kids.
Yeah.
I don't know if it started out that way, but whenever you're dealing with shows that appeal to the kids, automatically you're going to get some kind of marketing strategy that comes up.
Well, they did. This was a
with
big
merchandise.
thing. Once they realized that the kids were into it, instead of him being a Cold War CIA guy, that was softened up, and he would go on missions, and killing was out. Now, in the books, sometimes he would have to defend himself or, kill another operative. In the early days of the TV movies and the early series, he would have to take care of some business. But that stuff was basically instead, at this point, not as comical, but kind of like we did with the A-Team. People would get thrown, and then they'd be out of commission, if he tossed them. So with him not killing people anymore, he becomes more of a sympathetic character. Kids can, emulate him, and kids can look up to him. And it's a TV show, so it's not that big of a deal that he's not killing people. But they make toys. And let me tell you, these toys, everybody wanted these toys.
Well, who made these toys?
These were Kenner. It was about 2 years before Star Wars toys became huge. And the Steve Austin figure was about 12-inch tall, which is the standard at the time, the G.I. Joe size.
The G.I. Joe model.
Yeah. And he had some accessories, and he had originally a rocket ship, which was awful. You could put him in and you could see his face through the window, and it kind of was a rocket, but it was a piece of junk. And then that rocket opened up, though, to be a bionic hospital where you could work on the various bionic parts he had, which some could be removed in later figures. The original ones were in there. Some of them later you could remove them. You could roll up his sleeve and see his bionics on his arm. His eye had a hole in it where you could look through and act like you're seeing through his bionic eye, which it was.
Yeah,
awful.
I remember.
Like
I don't know if somebody showed it to me or I saw it somewhere where you actually looked through the back of his head.
Yes,
it almost looked like he had a gunshot wound through the head.
It's the same principle they use with the Boba Fett large size Star Wars figure that we've talked about in the past. You can look through it as if you're seeing something. But
did it come with any kind of plug to plug the hole? Or the hole was always there?
No, the hole was always there. Oh. So in addition to that, they eventually made a Bigfoot.
Okay.
Jamie Summers, Bionic Woman. They made Maskatron, which was his colleague that they wound up fighting.
And these are all in that 12-inch
scale.
These
are all the 12-inch scale. They made Fembots from the Bionic Woman. They made other types of adventure things. They were huge at the time, but they weren't very sophisticated. It was towards the end of the G.I. Joe style of figure, so it was basically, okay, we've got this guy, we'll put his head on, and he was in the tracksuit that they showed in the TV movie when he was, it was that red tracksuit, if you remember.
Yeah,
which he probably never wore that again.
Like some Adidas thing or something.
Yeah, he was more into wearing like 70s kind of like polyester shirts and slacks or, leisure suit jackets or whatever. It was a 70s thing, but these figures were very exciting, and I got them in 1976 for Easter. That was my big gift, and I was thrilled to have it. But it was short-lived because Star Wars was just around the corner.
Yeah, before it ate everything up.
Coincidentally, during the 70s, when the Steve Austin figures were big, G.I. Joe, which had kind of been waning, and they were trying to find ways to keep that relevant because after the Vietnam era, soldier toys weren't as exciting. So they had an adventure team, the G.I. Joe adventure team, rather than a military type guy. Still basically the same figure. And they had Atomic Man, which was Mike Powers. He was the Atomic Man, and he was bionic, and
Are these still the 12 inches, or they switched to the small ones?
No, the smaller ones hadn't come yet.
Come out yet.
The smaller ones didn't come till 1982 after they revived the whole G.I. Joe series.
Post Star Wars.
Yeah.
The toys I never got to, because by the time I got into the show, the toys were just not around. And I remember seeing the show, I believe, in black and white back in Uruguay, and I didn't see the entire series because I only saw episodes here or there, and I might have caught a couple of repeats here in color. Ooh, color. But nowhere near the amount of episodes that exist. I mean, if you figure each season is your typical, 22, 24, episode per year.
Yeah, it was a regular 70s kind of.
Right. And if you have 5 years worth of episodes, you're talking about, in the hundreds.
Yeah, it was done after 5 years, so you're probably 80 episodes, 100 episodes. And Bionic Woman, they were shown separately in syndication, but they're kind of like in the same world, so you could include them. Now,
with the toys on the Bionic Woman side, do you think those were aimed at girls, or that was
a
more
little
of
bit? You could do stuff. They were packaged there was a little more pink on the box,
more
and stuff
Barbie-ish
like that.
looking?
I never had the Bionic Woman, so I always assumed at the time, the Bionic Woman was for the girls.
For girls.
I'm sticking with Steve Austin. But I never had Bigfoot or the Maskatron either. I basically had Steve in the Bionic Hospital. So I guess I got over it pretty quick, but I'm glad I had it.
It's hard to find these toys now. I mean, you got to go to collector shops or flea markets sometimes.
In good condition. You can go on eBay and find them for I've recently checked to see if I'd really want to own it again. So for about $50, you could get a Steve Austin that's in pretty decent shape. I mean, it might have some flaws, or it's used, it doesn't have its box. But for $50, you could get, the basics. The thing is, when it ended, it was basically done. Now, it would be in syndication, but that was it. And then Steve Austin didn't come back until the 90s. And that was actually a surprise because Lee Majors had gone on to do The Fall Guy. And Lindsay Wagner, who was the Bionic Woman, had done other stuff. And so you would basically think this was done. But around the 90s, a lot of 70s nostalgia came back. And these guys were out there, and they were willing to participate. So they got him back for 3 Bionic movies. And they had various interesting plots. Sometimes they involved the Russians. It was actually pretty good. They were well made.
More contemporary.
Yeah, they were actually in the 90s. They were as if these Bionic people had gone on. They did their missions and they retired basically, or left the OSI. But by the third one, they actually got married. Finally, Jamie and Steve got married. So it was well done. I don't know. I think maybe they were trying to start a new Bionic series because some of the characters that are in it, you can see they're setting them up. I think Lee Major's son was one of them that they had considered in real life for his own series as another Bionic character. But in one episode, it talked about how his Bionics were breaking down after all these years finally.
Is he rusting like the Tin Man?
Well, I mean, I guess it's the equivalent of that, and how these parts are breaking down. Now, you would have assumed over the years, if he's got an arm from the 70s, they would have made, advances in these prosthetics, and he would have, but maybe that wasn't the intention. Maybe they did the operation originally, and these were expected to last, and now they weren't. But it all worked out at the end. But there was no other series, and it basically ended on a high note.
It's funny because now, when you watch the news and they show you like a medical piece about some prosthetic that somebody's being equipped with, either it's a soldier or somebody,
exactly,
and they keep referring to, it's just like the Bionic. It's actually better than the Bionic Man, so that it's become a point of reference now that stuff that used to be heavy sci-fi, it's now no, that's just the way it is now.
I've seen things.
That's what they do
I've
now.
seen pieces on soldiers who've gotten new parts and things. It's amazing where
super
it came
high-tech
from.
stuff.
It's kind of like when we talk about Star Trek, and we all have an iPhone and an iPad
cell phone,
now. And it was even more sophisticated than what they had on the Enterprise. So, hey, good for the people who need them, and I'm glad that it gave people something to strive for. Hey, we want to make it like Steve Austin. I don't think anybody has small nuclear reactors, though, in their arm and leg parts.
Now, recently, even though like you said, they might have tried to revive it and it didn't work, they did go with a Bionic Woman revival a couple years ago, and it really got nowhere. NBC tried it out.
It was the people who worked on Battlestar Galactica, the reboot of Battlestar Galactica. So it had good intentions. I just don't think there was anybody who was that interested in it, and probably the subject matter was a little flat too.
Right. I mean, it had a good production value. It had pretty cool effects, but it just wasn't that new of an idea. It wasn't that innovative anymore. It's like, we've seen that already. Okay, move on to the next thing. Now, Is there any news out there of a possible future for the $6 Million Man line to go in some direction, whether it's television, toys, films, whatever?
Well, there's different appearances sometimes in comics, things like that, people trying to get a revival that way. But in around 2003, Jim Carrey was going to be involved in a $6 Million Man movie, which I imagine would probably be more comedic. Even though he's more of a serious actor now, I just have a vibe they weren't going to take it serious. And at the end of 2011, there was talk of Bryan Singer doing an actual serious version with Leonardo DiCaprio, but these things are very, they're very suspect. Somebody has a property and they say, yeah, okay, he might be interested, or the guy might say, yeah, I'd be interested, but no scripts, no production, nothing. So I don't have any high hopes. It's a lot like with all these other remakes we hear about. Most of them turn out to be garbage. Every now and then we have a great one like Battlestar Galactica.
Yeah.
And so at this point, Lee Majors, Steve Austin, is my guy, and that's basically done. I've seen Lee lately, and he's looking okay, but he's not going back to that character. It's basically done.
Yeah. Now, let me ask you a question, because this always happens to us when we rewatch some of our old favorite shows. Does it hold up in any way?
I'd like it to, but this one doesn't. This one just feels a little slow and feels a little hokey, and it probably was slow and hokey back then, but we didn't know any better. I'd have to ask my parents and see if they remember what it was like watching it with me, because it just seems to me like really 70s production value, the background music, the world events, it was the typical kind of...
Right, the references don't match anymore.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you something, even though, you can kind of guess you're not heading into that same familiar territory you did when you were a kid, it would still be cool, and I want to watch at least a little of it. I want to see these pilots.
Yeah.
I want to see a little bit of the show to see if it kind of brings me back a little bit to that particular point.
If you're a fan of the series and you don't remember the pilots, I'd recommend don't watching the pilots. Actually, because they really slowed me down, and they kind of gave me the bad taste down the line and made me realize, hey, this wasn't. Had I just jumped into the Bigfoot episode, I'd recommend if you were a fan and you can rent or you feel like spending a few bucks to buy the particular seasons, wait for the Bionic Woman episodes in season 2,
That's
or the
when it
Bigfoot,
really
or the first Bigfoot episodes
started cooking
in season 3. And those are the ones you'll say, hey, that was pretty cool. And you can even find them sometimes in really bad quality on YouTube. But it's not one of those shows that people will get all nostalgic about, other than the premise that they liked.
Well, in my case, I'm sure, just like I've done in the past, I'll sit down with my son or my daughter and say, hey, listen, this is what I used to watch. And then I'll go to Netflix or something and stream
they'll
it.
leave the room.
And they'll just laugh at me for a couple of good hours, and I'll be like, oh, never mind.
I can't imagine anybody under 15 sitting through this.
If even.
It really, that's the way it feels.
But at the time, especially because this is pre-Star Wars, this was as important to us.
Oh, yeah.
When it came to watching it. Again, no VCRs, no DVRs. You had to sit there and physically watch the damn thing. And the toys. You had toys that went with the show, so that's the best of both worlds.
When I was a kid, before I wanted to be a Jedi Knight, I wanted to be Steve Austin.
Without arms or legs. All right, well, thank you, James, for joining us today. I hope you guys enjoyed our little trip down memory lane, back into the 70s and the good old days of television when special effects were very, very minimal. And I hope you'll be here next time when we discuss another one of these bizarre subjects that we seem to always find here on Geekfest Rants. Bye-bye, everybody.
Can't beat him if you can't, love him if you can. Now he's the man, $6 million man.
Stop.